So as we know, England's first attempt at a permanent colony in the New World was thwarted due to a war with Spain and neglect. When John White returned to the colony at Roanoke, he found it abandoned. So settlement in the New World quickly fell by the wayside because of massive war debt and a failing growing season, along with Elizabeth's failing health. In 1606, a group of Englishmen commissioned the Virginia Charter for a claim to the New World. The Virginia Charter, named after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, granted the group a tract of land. Within the charter, specific language was added to ensure colonists were granted the same rights as Englishmen. This is important to note because it will be a point of contention leading to the Revolution. So in 1607, the voyagers landed in the Chesapeake and named it Jamestown after King James I. As we have discussed previously, the goal of the Jamestown colony was to find gold and return to England. The location of Jamestown was more or less determined through the charter, as this was the area considered, all of Virginia, just north of the original colony at Roanoke. So it's just a continuation of what the Virginia Charter had previously owned, if you will. So with the understanding that the goal was to find gold, clearly any settlement of any kind would be considered later on. The ships arrived carrying little supplies necessary for building shelter, plowing fields for crops, and the men who came were considered gentlemen, meaning very few possessed any skills, especially skills that would be considered like blue-collar skills today. No women or family were present to aid in colonization, as many men were young and single or had little intention to live in an underdeveloped wilderness. So 3 ships arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake and were immediately attacked by the natives, later known as the Powhatans. The men quickly moved up the James River to what will become Jamestown Colony. The area allowed for a better chance at defense, but exposed the men to mosquitoes carrying malaria. This, along with a lack of shelter, food, and skills, will prove deadly to over half the settlement. From 1610 to 1624, 10,000 men and women migrated to Jamestown, and in 1624, only 1,200 had survived. Another issue included a lack of community. As more and more landowners acquired large tracts of land to cultivate tobacco, the distance between colonists grew, leading to difficulties with defense against the natives. So to sum up, the Chesapeake colony suffered and struggled due to their own shortcomings. The colonists came unprepared, had little to no survival training, and no work ethic. Laziness was the nail in the coffin, so to speak. Many of the colonists resorted to violence and theft. Natives were targeted for their food supplies. As theft continued, the Powhatans stopped growing corn. Tensions rose, leading to a series of wars that left many dead and a loss of land for the Powhatans. As noted previously, community life was almost non-existent. Few women were present in the colony, and with a high mortality rate, the population growth remained stagnant. The statistics here note the struggle the colonies continued to suffer even as tobacco became the cash crop of the Chesapeake. With declining relations with the natives and the marshy, wet areas created a breeding ground for mosquitoes, the Virginia colonists saw a loss of many lives. Surprisingly, women in the Chesapeake benefited from the high mortality rate as they acquired their husbands' land and wealth, allowing for more power within the community. Tensions continued to grow with the Powhatans, and the English colonists as more settlers arrived in Virginia. By 1610, the First Anglo-Powhatan War began. At this time, the colonists were starving and dying by the dozens. They repeatedly raided the Powhatans' food supplies and pillaged their villages. While times of peace occurred with John Rolfe marrying Pocahontas, periodic attacks continued. So in 1622, John Rolfe was killed and the Virginia Company called for a perpetual war. Raiding continued, reducing the native population and drove them further west. By 1644, the last effort was made by the Powhatans in the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. And the natives lost, and a peace treaty was signed in 1646. The treaty removed the Powhatans from their original land and formally separated the Powhatan and English settlement. Okay, so although not founded for religious motives, Virginia claimed the Church of England or the Anglican Church as the official religion of the colony. Freedom of religion was not an issue as the colony agreed to follow the king's religion. But let's talk about Maryland. So Maryland was considered part of the Chesapeake colonies. Maryland had a favorable climate and soil for growing tobacco, but was less marshy, meaning much healthier. A royal charter was granted to George Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore, in 1632. It was known as a proprietary colony as it was a gift to Lord Baltimore. Baltimore was a Catholic and he wanted to create a haven for Catholics in the colonies. He divided the land and gave it to his Catholic relatives, thus creating Catholic land barons. Unfortunately, not many Catholics colonized in Maryland, and by the 1630s, arable land was lacking in the New England colonies. More and more Puritan farmers began to migrate south to Maryland to work the land. So a haven for Catholics soon became overrun by Protestants. In order to keep a lid on persecution of the Catholics living in Maryland, the colony drafted the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649. It granted toleration to all Christians and insisted death upon those who denied Jesus, meaning those who practiced Judaism. Surprisingly, Maryland became less tolerant with the adoption of the Toleration Act. All right, in 1619, the House of Burgesses assumed the role of the House of Commons in England within the Virginia colony. So this becomes their government, if you will. They controlled the local finances and the militia, your basic local government issues. By the end of the 17th century, the House of Burgesses was able to initiate legislation. This begins the pulling away period from the English monarchy. It set the standard for future legislative bodies in the colonies, opening the door for more of a democracy. Okay, so lastly, create a list determining the limits to a colonial democracy.